In Hinduism, the end-of-life process does not begin only after the individual takes their final breath or the heart beats its final beat, but instead is a process that begins well before an individual reaches that final stage. What happens to an individual after death in the Hindu religion is dependent on the preparations taken throughout their life, as well as the performance of pre-mortem and post-mortem rituals. Pre-death rituals include placing the dying adult on the ground facing north with their head shaved, as a shaved head is believed to signify the body's return to purity. The individual is given water from the Ganges to drink, unless they are unable to swallow, in which case the water is placed on the lips. The person is then asked to repeat the meditative sound of Om to help clear the mind. Some, instead of Om, may sing devotional hymns, all of which are meant to ensure the dying individual clears the mind in order to focus on God. This ritual is not the same for Hindu children, where instead of being placed on the ground, the child is allowed to pass in the arms of a caregiver. Disclosure and last rites are an important part of the pre-death process in Hinduism in order to allow a person to die what is considered a good death. Denial, whether it be that of the person dying or that of their relatives, causes non-disclosure when a person dies unexpectedly, before they are able to get their affairs in order or before their relatives are able to give last rites and say goodbye. One example of this is in the story of the Gujarati man Suresh and his son Ramesh. The Hindu family practitioner warned Ramesh that his father's diagnosis of prostate cancer and tuberculosis would be terminal. But Ramesh was in denial of his father's inevitable death and chose not to share the prognosis with his father. Suresh died unexpectedly, alone, in Ramesh's absence, leaving Ramesh riddled with guilt because he had not been present in his father's final moments to give him his last rites and say goodbye. Withdrawal of treatment and euthanasia have very different post-mortem outcomes in the Hindu religion, one being seen as an appropriate way to die and the other as negative. A willed death, or voluntary relinquishment of the body, is not seen as a negative early departure, but instead a necessary preparation procedure for impending death. For an individual who is terminally ill, fasting is seen as a spiritual purification, promoting detachment, and is also seen as a way to ensure there is no expelling of bodily fluids after death, which in Hinduism is a sign of a bad death. An individual facing death can also decide to stop taking medication so that they may die with a clear and unclouded mind. A Hindu person facing death may also decide to stop taking medication because of their view that experiencing pain is a way of expurgating sin. Suicide, on the other hand, is seen as a negative and selfish early departure where the person is not allowed important post-mortem rites and results in bad karma for the soul's next life. Euthanasia in Hinduism seems to be a little more controversial than suicide, with some believing a person who dies by euthanasia will suffer the same bad karma, and others believing the Hindu people have a duty to end another person's suffering. An earlier study quoted by Firth believed that karma does not give people the right to keep a suffering person alive when all they desire is a peaceful death. It was also stated that there is a belief that it is no less of a sin to let a person suffer when compared to helping them reach a peaceful death. Another important part of Hindu death rituals is the pilgrimage to Kashi, which can be completed either before or after death. Part of the pre-death ritual, including laying on the banks of the Ganga or placing water from the Ganga on the lips of the dying, is best obtained in Kashi, where water from the Ganga is most potent. Kashi is believed to be the great cremation place, and dying there is believed to be a way to obtain moksha, or the release from the cycle of being rebirthed. Some individuals who either cannot get to Kashi before they die, or who do not feel that arriving in the city before death is as important, choose to have their bodies or parts of their bodies sent to Kashi post-mortem, so they may be cremated in the great cremation place, followed by the release of their ashes in the Ganga. In Hinduism, death can be considered good or bad based on how a person lived their life, as well as when and how they died. Control and choice of the manner of death, time of death, and place of death can determine a good death versus a bad death. Good death, occurs at the right age or life stage, with the dying person either on the ground at home with water from the Ganges or on the banks of the Ganges. In order to die what is considered a good death, an individual must have lived a life with selfless actions. In Hinduism, a person prepares for a good death throughout their life and enters the process of death consciously and willingly. Another requirement to reach a good death is a person must devote their life to the love for one God instead of many. A person must also cleanse their wrongdoings in order to die with good karma, which, as stated earlier, can be accomplished when a person decides to stop taking medication or fast in the final stages of their life. If a good death is accomplished, it is thought the body of the deceased will include a peaceful facial expression with a slightly open mouth or eyes, and the absence of vomit or other bodily fluids. There are also times of the year that are better than others. The good time period, which is also called the path of the gods, takes place during the 6 months of the year following winter solstice, and the bad time period being called the path of those who will be reborn, which is during the darker months and days. In order to follow the path of the gods and die a good death, a person should try to avoid dying during the dark half of the month or at night. Bad death includes violent, premature, and uncontrolled deaths in the wrong place at the wrong time, often resulting in a contorted facial expression and the release of feces, urine, and/or vomit at the time of death. Bad karma is also signified by the release of bodily fluids immediately after death. Life ended by suicide is considered a selfish action and will also result in bad death. Other incidences that would signify a bad death in Hinduism include being killed by an animal, being killed by an unclean person, dying on a bed, death by drowning, or falling from a fatal height. Failure to follow correct end-of-life rituals can leave a soul unable to move on, haunting relatives and causing bad luck, illness, nightmares, and infertility. Some believe that the surviving relatives need to place blame on something or someone in order to process and deal with the death of a loved one. A premature death of a young man leaves his parents without a future caretaker and leaves his wife stigmatized and excluded from certain ceremonies, both of which can be unbearably upsetting. So placing blame on the deceased, having bad karma, makes these situations more bearable. Post-death rituals are also an important part of the process of death in Hinduism. Post-death rituals can help those grieving a loss deal with their loss and help the deceased soul reach its final resting place. When a person in the Hindu religion dies, their body is bathed, massaged in oils, dressed in new clothes, and then cremated before the next sunrise so the soul can transition from this world to the next. For 10 days, rituals are conducted, and it is believed that during these rituals the deceased soul is watching over the family. It is on the 11th day that the deceased member's soul is released from its attachment to its earthly life and is free to continue to its next journey. Funerals take place in the home of the deceased, officiated by a Hindu priest, and include specific funeral chants or mantras. Cremation is customary in Hinduism, but this varies between adults and children. For adults, it is customary to cremate the deceased during a cremation ceremony, where the eldest son presides over the rituals while the priest oversees. After the cremation, there may be a reception at the family's home that could be open only to family or allow others to attend, depending on the family's wishes. Children, specifically those younger than 2 years, are not cremated like adults, but instead are buried. Reincarnation, or the rebirth of a person after death into a new physical body, is not necessarily seen as a positive event after death in Hinduism. Hindus believe the soul reincarnates time and time again until all karmas from previous lives have been resolved. Once this cleansing of all past karmas has been achieved, the soul can attain moksha, or the liberation from the repetitive cycle of rebirth. One could then say that reincarnation could be a result of a bad death, where the deceased person was unable to cleanse their soul of sins or bad karma before they died. Liberation from reincarnation for a child soul is believed to take much longer compared to that of an adult soul. The afterlife of a child's soul consists of continual rebirth, because the death of a child is thought as a negative and signifies a previous life ending with bad karma. The processes involved in the end of life in Hinduism, pre death, death, and post death, are all an important part of determining the fate of a soul. The age and manner at which the individual has died is also an important determination of the soul's journey into the next life. Dying a good death is a very important part of the end of life process in Hinduism and is the best way to assure the individual and their loved ones that the soul will reach moksha.